Okay, let's make a start. Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to another episode of Lifting the Lid, our free monthly webinar series where we lift the lid on strategic communication excellence. My name is Sia Papagiorgio and I am the Director at the Centre for Strategic Communication Excellence. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, where we're finally allowed out of the house, but wherever you are, I hope you and your families are safe and well. Today, I am so pleased to introduce you to my guest, government social media expert and president of the Canberra chapter of the International Association of Business Communicators, Amanda Dennett. Amanda's here to talk about social media best practice, including the skills and processes your team needs to do it well and measure its effectiveness. She's also done something that no one in Australia has ever done, and that's conduct research on the workings of Australian government social media teams. On Twitter, she's known as Mandy in Transit, where she also curates the government social media daily, a daily wrap-up of research, highlights and best practice from Australia and around the world. Please welcome Amanda Dennett. Hi, Amanda, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Sia. Thanks so much.
Just one item of housekeeping before we begin, and that is there will be plenty of time at the end of our chat to answer any questions you have. So please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Everybody knows the Zoom drill by now. I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the next hour, and I'll make sure we get to your questions at the end. So Amanda, as I mentioned earlier, you've conducted some pretty comprehensive research into the workings of Australian government social media teams. What did you discover?
Well, I found out that while social media is being used by most agencies and departments across the federal public sector, the way that they use it and the processes that they have is really vary. And while that can be sometimes appropriate, depending on the type of work that you're doing, it does mean that some teams are operating without perhaps the right processes and frameworks in place for them to be truly successful.
Okay. So tell me, what are some of the ways the Australian government is using social media right now?
So probably the most relevant for the moment is COVID-related messaging that's coming out from federal government agencies such as the Department of Health, as well as state government agencies and local councils. As the situation changes, people are turning to social media to keep across the news. We've all been reading about issues of fake news and trust through social media at the moment. And so having government agencies present to share legitimate information in the mix has been really important during this time.
And what about in regards to the types of challenges that that government agencies are faced with when it comes to social media that maybe the business world doesn't face? What are some of those challenges?
I think that it is a bit more of a risk-averse environment in the government context. So perhaps aligned similarly with some of the kind of banking and finance industries where they have really strict regulations about what they can communicate. Governments also operate in an environment where things are a bit more critically watched. People have different expectations about communications from government, and we see that have an impact not just on whether or not agencies decide to take up social media and how they implement it, but also it presents challenges for the day-to-day work of people in social media teams. And so I'll go into that in a bit more detail today.
Okay. Now, just before we get into some of those other specifics, in your bio, you mentioned that you implemented social media customer service at the Department of Human Services. Excuse my ignorance, Amanda, but what is social media customer service exactly?
Well, social media customer service is a bit of an evolution from the social media for PR approach, which is to sort of broadcast messages, perhaps get a little bit of feedback. But certainly early on, the idea was to put out messages and hopefully get feedback that, an agency wanted to hear. And I think, sharing an idea, please let us know what you think. And without really giving people the ability to influence what the outcome might be. So as an evolution of that, social media customer service says, rather than just giving information to people, why not use social media in a way that might resolve a whole query so that they don't have to take another action? For example, calling a call center or visiting a government service office. So it is the next step. Now, of course, there are privacy implications for that. And I'm not really aware of agencies that do full end-to-end customer service through social media from a because of that privacy element. So there are some aspects that people will always need to move into a private channel for, but a number of agencies are having success in that area, and I was able to speak to them as part of my research.
Okay, so did you want to take us through some of the elements of your research, or did you want me to keep going with my line of questioning? Because I can do either.
Well, look, how about I give a bit of an overview, and then we can go into some questions, because I think that'll be the most interesting bit.
Yep, sure.
Great. So just by way of introduction, my name is Amanda, as Sia said, and I've been working in government communications for about 16 or 17 years. Always within a government context, and I'm pretty passionate about public sector communications. I think that being able to communicate effectively with mass audiences is really exciting and challenging, and yeah, it's something that I've grown really passionate about throughout my career. So one of the most common questions that I would receive while doing this research, so I've spent sort of the last 2.5 years or so looking at social media use by government, is why on earth would you do that when you're working as well? Are you mad? And I might be a bit mad, but it is a case of finding something that you're interested in and then wanting to know more about why it works the way it does. And also, whether or not we can do a bit better. And so I've worked in social media for about the last 10 years across a couple of social media teams, and meeting with others from colleagues from other agencies, we would discover that we were all searching for better ways to do things or to understand more about how one another were working. And we didn't really have a solid way to do that that was, effective and useful in our day to day. So I decided to delve a bit deeper and see if I could come up with something that would help people with that work. Now, I've only gone part way. There's still a lot more work to be done, but I wanted to share the early learnings from my research. So I wanted to start first by talking about social media work, which I hadn't really heard of until I started doing research, but it is a bit of a no-brainer. People who work in social media undertake social media work, but it is different to other communication work in that it is 24/7 digital labor. So whilst not all people will monitor all the time what is happening on social media, it does change people's work hours so that often they'll be minding social media accounts until late in the evening. We've got Senate estimates running for federal government at the moment, so there'll be social media workers across the Australian Public Service watching their mobile phones in case something happens on Twitter, and that's quite a change from the regular public service hours that other comms practitioners might be used to. Social media workers are really heavily influenced by the social media platforms themselves and the norms that occur on those platforms, the way that people use them, as well as the algorithms and the limitations of the platforms themselves. So when coming up with content for social media, workers need to be really cognizant of that and often change their tactics based on those limitations. The nature of social media work means that work-life balance lines can often be blurred. And that's something that came up in my research and discussions with social media workers in Australia, is that, high-performing teams can often have burnout and a sense of, not really being able to take a break because something's always happening on social media. And then finally, with social media work, just as the platforms themselves influence workers, the workers themselves are also permeating their ways of working across their organisations. So often we'll see organisations becoming more responsive, being more focused on their reputation and brand, which is something as communicators that we're all always talking with our and providing advice on and talking with our colleagues about. As well as bringing more of a data and measurement focus. So social media is a great area of communications in that some elements can be easy to measure. There are some key numbers that we can use. And so, those kind of principles are permeating across organizations as well. So one of the areas that I looked at in my research relates to organisational structure and work process. So perhaps not the sexiest topic to talk about, but I really wanted to understand how are social media teams put together, how many people are in those teams, and what processes do they have to support the work that they do. So what I found was that, of the teams that I looked at, I spoke to two federal government agencies, the Department of Human Services, which is now Services Australia, as well as the Australian Taxation Office. And then I also ran a survey and reached people from across 17 Australian government agencies, and found out that there are teams ranging from 2 to 25 people working on social media, and that almost 70% work in teams with 6 or less workers. Most government social media teams are also responsible for other comms activities, so not many are dedicated to social media alone. In fact, that was quite a small number. And so it shows that teams will be under varied pressures to manage social media, as well as perhaps managing media queries or long-term communication strategies. Most agencies had a clearance process in place for their content, but as I'll talk about a bit later, some of those can be a barrier to their success. But the level of process change was really varied. So one example is an agency where some employees that are quite low level, so perhaps APS 5 or 6 staff, would publish content and manage what went out there without much oversight by anyone at all. Others where content goes up to a senior executive level very regularly, so that all content might be cleared before it's published, which is quite restrictive. So there are two really extremes on the spectrum across those agencies. And so it's trying to find out where in there actually constitutes best practice. I was really interested to find out that more than a third of agencies don't have a process for managing social media outside the 9 to 5 hours. Some respondents said that they keep an eye on it because they care about their work and they want to try to minimise risk, but they aren't paid for that work. And others just don't really have a watch of that at all, and they'll come in the next morning and see what's waiting there, which, in a 24/7 kind of news cycle can be, 12 hours can be a long time for an issue to be running. So further to that, I drilled down into what are the top rated skills for members of social media teams that the team members themselves thought were important, as well as their managers. So managers overwhelmingly thought that good judgment is critical, but interestingly, it rated very highly for the social media workers themselves. So being able to see amongst their colleagues that someone who can make a good decision is really critical for social media. It surprised me that writing and editing fell so high to the top, but it was the second rated skill as the most important to have in your social media team from the teams themselves. The ability to turn content into something that is easy to understand, rated above an understanding of the platforms themselves, and even having crisis comms and issues management skills, which I expected to fall a little bit higher up given the current environment that we've had in the last couple of years with media crises and issues that get quite a big run in the media. So that actually rated lower down the scale. And then finally, audience and customer focus. So audience focus is really important for social media, for all communication activities really, but it was, out of the top 5, it was rated the lowest by social media workers and managers of social media teams. So next I looked at how we can measure success in social media activities and specifically in a government context, but often these do apply across the industry more broadly. So through my research, but also research undertaken in the United States, it's overwhelmingly found that government workers believe really strongly that their social media activities are valuable, but they can't always demonstrate how or why that is. And I think that resonates with me as a long-time communicator, that often we will have campaigns or strategies or messages that we know work, but we won't always have perhaps the skills or tools in order to demonstrate really clearly and powerfully why that is the case. Measurement of social media activities in government can sometimes be ad hoc, and it can be a time-consuming part of the work. And so, and some of the metrics that are being used are of limited value. So very early on, one of the key numbers to report was, the number of followers or friends or likes on an account. And, we've all learned since then that there are better measures about whether or not you're reaching your audience on social media. When I asked people about what they do measure, engagement was overwhelmingly the key measure that people are using. So social media workers see that engagement is the key number that they should be putting out there. So that's the likes, comments, and shares generally that they're achieving on their content. And social media workers in government trend towards using anecdotal evidence to show that their work is having an impact. And that sort of feeds off my first point that, while they know that it's powerful and they've got some examples, there's not that, hard data often that's showing them why it's effective. I also looked at the risks and barriers to implementation of social media in government. And as I mentioned previously, the onerous approval processes for content rated pretty highly. And so that's come in at number 2. And it's something that workers see as a real difficulty for them often in getting their job done. Number 1, which might not be a surprise to anyone in the comms team really, is lack of resources. So often we're required to do and deliver a lot without a lot of resource. And so, that was definitely rated highest. And that doesn't just mean the number of people. I think it can also mean the amount of work required to do doesn't match the number of people. And so that can be as simple as reframing the strategy and the expectations rather than just hiring more staff, which we know can be difficult in the current context. And the third top rated risk and barrier to implementation that social media workers saw was internal business areas giving preference to corporate style messages over creative content. So the clearance of content, as we know, is really important, making sure that what goes out is accurate and that it maintains the brand's same purpose and values. But there was a really strong sense amongst social media workers of wanting to put out content that would really resonate with an audience, that was creative, and that showed government as a bit more than, a robot. And yet it was identified that working with internal stakeholders could often make that challenging. So following on from that, I've made some recommendations for best practice social media, which are quite high level, but they're my starting point, and I'm hoping to do some further research in this field. And I'm also interested in creating some tools that are shareable for people working in government social media. So if that's of interest, please pop something in the comments and let me know, and I can distribute that through SIA later as well. It might take me a bit of time to pull it together though. So the recommendations that I came up with based on these discussions and early research was about establishing clear strategies and setting measures for those, and then reporting regularly. Now that is communication 101 for most of us, but it so often does not happen for social media strategies. So how you do that will really depend on the way that your organisation works. You might have a strategy for your account overall. How do you want to grow your social media presence and engage with your audience? Or it might be campaign based, depending on the type of work that you do. But establishing those strategies is really important, and it can help you break down some of those issues that you might have with clearing more creative content if you've if you've established what your aims are with some of your key stakeholders early. Regular reporting is really important. Having a strategy in place and then evaluating it at the end to see how you went is missing a whole lot of opportunities to tailor the way that you are working and to re-implement or to try new things throughout your campaign to see how it goes and to try to do things differently to perhaps achieve better results. The second recommendation is adequately resourcing and skilling social media teams. So that might be easier said than done if you aren't in a role with some of that decision-making power. But many of us do have some influence over the hiring of teams. And even if we don't, there's no reason why we can't make recommendations to the leaders of our teams for opportunities for new skills for our team. So whether that's taking on some professional learning on the job for the team, or thinking about, as someone leaves the team, do we need to recruit exactly the same skill set of the person who's just left? Or is there a gap in our team, for example, in data analytics, that we should be recruiting for instead that would help us all do our work better? And I think sometimes we get a bit static in the way that we think about the positions in our teams. And so the feedback I received really was that the diversity of the people within teams and their diversity of skill sets leads to better outcomes for and performance for the teams themselves, because they have complementary skills that help them to get the best outcome. My third recommendation is doing homework to manage risk. This is probably the most boring part of the recommendations, but what I did find was that in a lot of cases, processes don't exist for some of this work. And I was talking with a colleague in the last week who used to work in government and is now working in a consultancy, often for government, who was surprised at often how many agencies are operating without some of the core processes that they need to support their work. And I think we are busy, but this is important work to do. And often by reaching out to other agencies, you might be able to borrow and share some of their frameworks and build upon those for your environment. Which leads me to my last recommendation, which is about formalising networks for sharing best practice and benchmarking. So in my research, I asked government social media workers who they think is doing social media well, who they look to for best practice, and what they consider to be best practice. And what I found was that often workers in social media teams are keeping an eye on the work that others are doing, but they're doing it through some handy old online stalking. So they are following each other's accounts, seeing what they're doing, but without really reaching out to one another to say, hey, that was cool. How did you come up with that? How did you get approval for that? How is that tracking? Is it reaching the audience? We've got a similar audience. Can we meet to share those ideas and learnings? And I don't know whether or not that is just the nature of kind of busy work and times, or whether we haven't kind of fostered an environment of sharing across government. But those networks don't really exist. The culture of that doesn't really exist within social media teams. Now, there are a couple of ways that people share best practice. I'm a member of IABC, the Comms Association. So often there'll be best practice sharing through those networks. The federal government does have a ComCan network where people who work across government do come together quarterly to share best practice and case studies. So there are pockets of best practice sharing, but certainly not when it comes to benchmarking. I don't think that there is an openness across agencies to share the benchmarks and KPIs that they're using for their social media activities. And I think that's to the detriment of all of us, because we would be able to help one another more if we shared more of that content. So finally, I wanted to finish briefly by just talking about undertaking research within your own career, and then I'll answer some questions from Sia and anyone else who might have some. I did choose to undertake research, as I said, because I'd been working in the field for a while and I was curious about the way that things are and also interested in trying to make them better. But full on research isn't for everyone. I do want to spruik using research more regularly in your day-to-day work. I do think that that is communication best practice, and increasingly there is more and more social media research available that you can use. And often they're available through research libraries, so that you don't have to pay to access it all. But I think we have lost the art of drawing upon Australian and international research when coming up with our strategic communication plans for social media. So I wanted to spruik that. If you're passionate about a topic, do pursue it with research. There are plenty of niche research topics in the communication field that are still available for you to explore. And that doesn't have to be through a university degree. If you're not interested in that, you can simply become an expert within your own career and your own readings and writings if you wanted to publish content. And there are plenty of platforms for that now. And specialization can really help your career. I think it has helped me. I do have other comms experience, but it has helped me make so many new networks and connections by having a specialization. But also don't silo yourself. I think it's important to have and maintain generalist communication skills so that you can work with colleagues to implement social media campaigns alongside other comms activities. So that's a really high level whirlwind overview of the research that I did. And so Sia and I'll do a few questions and talk through a bit more.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That was amazing. That's really insightful research. So now I have a whole bunch of new questions for you, but I want to touch on a couple of those of the points you made through what you discovered through your research in a moment. But I just wanted to make a point about, first of all, great recommendations. Particularly the one about doing research and finding that evidence. This is something as senior communication professionals we teach to our students and through the training that I conduct. I think it's really, really important when we are going to our senior leaders to fight for resources and budget, that we take these, this evidence to our senior leaders to say, this is how other agencies are doing it. This is how it could help us. This is what was discovered. So I just want to ask you, I know you've been talking about this research. I know you're also presenting at GovComms in November. What are you going to do with this research? What's the next step? I mean, what's next?
Yeah, so look, it's my aim to publish. I want to publish a summary about it that can be used by government agencies. So that's my next step, because I think that there are some key facts and recommendations that I've uncovered that would help teams sort of build their own mini business cases internally. So I want to do that, and then it will eventually be published online as well. I think through the Swinburne. So I've been studying at Swinburne University, so it'll go up in their research library, I think, and so I'd be happy to share that. And then, I'm still deciding whether or not to keep going and do a bit more, because I also am interested in looking at the AI and how that will begin to influence the way that social media is being used by governments, specifically for communication and social media. So sort of building a bit further on the research.
Okay.
Yeah, and from there, I guess I'd be interested to hear what people see as gaps and what tools they might need, and to talk more about it.
Okay, so don't forget, keep asking those questions. We do have one question that was asked that I also have on my list, so I'll get to that in a moment. Just in relation to best practice also, would you mind, when you get a moment, Amanda, just to pop the handle from your Government Social Media Daily wrap up into the chat as well, if people want to follow that, if they're not already following. I think that would be a good thing as well. So Just in regards to engagement, I know you touched on that in your research, but what does good engagement look like on social media, particularly as it relates to government agencies?
I think good engagement relates to reaching and connecting in a meaningful way with the audience that you intended to reach. And so while I think that many people working in social media do report on engagement and they often are achieving good engagement rates, it can be difficult to take the next step to look at whether or not the people that you're reaching are within the target group, and whether or not their engagement levels are higher, or is it one or two influencers that aren't really part of your key audience that have shared it elsewhere, and that's the result. That's the reason why you've achieved higher reach and engagement. So I think that yeah, that is a bit of a measurement difficulty that teams grapple with, and part of that can be is that you often can't automate that type of work. It requires workers in social media teams to bring their analysis to that measurement, which is time consuming and difficult for small teams. I think that meaningful engagement for on social media in general, but also for government agencies, is giving people the information that they need, and that they're asking for in a way that they can understand. And so often, we will use social media as a broadcast channel. Here's a media release or here's a new product. But more meaningful engagement is putting out actually listening to what people are talking about relating to your brand or agency, and then tailoring content that meets that need. So they're saying, I'm hungry, you give them something to eat. They're saying, I'm bored, you give them something to read, for example. So, and that is way more, that is much more significant engagement than simply, looking at that engagement number.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. So I find it then really surprising that audience and knowledge about your audience rated so low on the skill set, because if you are going to get that engagement online and resonate with your audience and give them what they need, shouldn't we be focusing our energies on getting to know our citizens and getting to know?
Yeah. Look, I thought that was interesting too, and I can shed a bit of light on that. So in that came up quite strongly in the survey that I did online, and so I didn't really have an opportunity to probe people further about why they rated it the way that they did. But I did hold 6 in-depth conversations with staff members from the Department of Human Services and the ATO. And this was a topic of discussion. And the reason why audience and customer focus rated lower isn't because they care about it less, but more that they had a strong sense that they could bring those skills to a team and build a culture of that more readily than they could teach good judgment and good writing and editing to some of their staff. So I think that was the key reason, was that those can be more readily learned and passed on within a team environment than perhaps good judgment.
Okay. So we're getting a couple of questions in, and I'm going to get to those in a moment. But I read something recently that was along the lines of there are 2 types of social media accounts: soapboxes and dinner parties. A soapbox focuses on the organisation, and they use that as a one-way channel to push out their messages, whereas a dinner party invites the audiences in and encourages discussion and engagement. How can we, whether we are a government agency or any business, type of business or brand, create dinner party accounts on social media? What should we be focusing on?
I think shifting our focus to having open conversations where we aren't afraid to hear perhaps some negative feedback. And this can be quite difficult for any brand to create a level of comfort about, but it's really critical if you want to build a trust relationship with your audience. And at the moment, trust in social media platforms is as low as ever, but the way that people trust government and even some brands is quite high. And so it's difficult because we're using platforms that people are having a problem with, to reach them with messages that we're pretty sure that they want to hear from us. And so I think it's important to keep that broader context in mind. But it is putting out topics for discussion and asking for feedback on key initiatives that people can really have an influence on. So consultation, where you put out something and say, please tell us out of 10 how much you like it, isn't really consultation. But certainly in my time in government comms, have been asked to, put forward some consultations like that, and having to push back to say, let's build something that instead lets people influence even one small part of your project so that they have some buy-in and later they hopefully become advocates for your work. So I think putting forward real opportunities to give feedback. And I've got an example that is an oldie for me, but is still really relevant today. And I think it's about being open to changing the way that you engage depending on how people want to engage with you online. So, you can have your strategy. We want to put out this content, but you need to keep it dynamic so that if people and your audiences online decide that they need something different from you, you can respond to that. So one example that I have is from working in human services, and very early on we created a Facebook account for students. So key audience at the time, lots of students using Facebook. That might not be the case today, but that was the primary channel for those leaving high school and going to university. And we wanted to reach them with information about youth allowance while they were studying. And what we found was that even though we had very high engagement rates on our content, lots of students asking questions, our follower levels remained relatively static and would sometimes go down. And we thought, how can this be when you need to kind of like our page in order to comment? But what we found was that often students would like our page, ask us a series of questions, and we would have whole conversations trying to get them more info about youth allowance so that they could make a claim and have all the information they needed ready. And then they would unlike the account and go away. So they were using it to reach out to government, get the information that they need, ask a couple of questions to clarify, and then move on. And they don't really want regular updates from the government on their social media feed, and that's fine. So it's about reframing. We thought perhaps we weren't doing a good job, but in fact, we were doing exactly what was needed by that audience at the time. And so I think changing the way that you think about what is effective communication with your audiences is really important, and that creates more of a dinner party vibe. You accept the invite, then you go home when you're ready.
Yeah.
I think that's entirely relevant. So
very relevant, Amanda. Thank you. Now, my next question was also asked by Ashley in the chat. When it comes to government and social media, who does it well? And Ashley's obviously asked something very similar. Which government departments do you think use social media the best?
Look, I chose human services and the ATO for my research because I do think that they are both leading in the content that I see, but also the scale at which they deliver. So, around tax time, both agencies are dealing with tens of thousands of social media queries each day or week, depending on the time. And so I think, there isn't anyone else in Australia that's doing it at that volume, except perhaps some of the state emergency agencies that will deal with those volumes during emergency events. But I'm not aware that they do the same level of audience and customer engagement. I think that's more for monitoring and distribution of key messages, so not the one-on-one interaction. When I asked people in my research, a lot pointed to police agencies as being key and good best practice users of social media. So the AFP is the only federal agency there. Most are state agencies. And I think that comes down to their balance of having some of that creative and engaging content. We've all seen some of the police videos that have gone viral through social media over the last few years. And so I think that really resonates with social media workers because of their desire to be able to do more of that content. And also, they intersperse that with some of the serious information that they need to share. So they're quite good at using creative content to build a large audience, and then they have them sitting there waiting for when they need to distribute a really critical message.
Yep.
I think during this time, the Department of Health has done a great job trying to use social media for COVID and other health information, and centralizing some of the tools and communication tools that people can use so that other government agencies and even community-based agencies have been sharing through social media and also printing on the front door of their shop some of that core communication information that's come from health. So I think that's great. And in the past, the ABS census team has also done a great job through social media of sharing really interesting information in an engaging way. And so I think that those are the things that resonate with people, is a bit of humanity in government social media accounts.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on that. You made a good point. It's about balance. And just because you are a government agency doesn't mean you have to always be so formal and so, all about the work. If you look at Victoria Police, for example, I follow them on social, and they put out some fantastic stories and anecdotes, and they're quite funny on social media, which is really, really engaging. Do you have any advice for particularly federal government agency workers who would come up against those issues that you spoke about earlier about, approvals? Obviously, having worked in the ATO myself, I know how complex some of these larger government agencies can be. So what advice do you have for teams when trying to be that little bit more engaging and creative on social?
I think using some evidence to support why you're proposing that approach is really important. The chance to do something a bit funny, can be tempting, but it isn't always appropriate for an audience. So, at the moment, I work at the Australian War Memorial, and we are rarely funny. And that's because the topics that we deal with are really sensitive. We're about commemoration. We often share posts remembering those who went to war and didn't return. And so our creative content is based on telling really powerful stories about Australia's servicemen and servicewomen, from the late 1800s through to today. And so there might be pockets of humour and larrikinism that we can highlight and share, but it's quite rare for us. And so I think creativity doesn't have to just be humorous. It can be, it can have a different tone, and it needs to be a tone that's relevant for the organisation that you're representing. I think you said it well earlier, Sia, about using some of those examples from other government agencies to help build your case. So apart from some research and evidence about why you're taking the approach you are, so perhaps this type of content works best with this audience, or this channel that we wouldn't normally use, like Snapchat, is best for this target audience because there are teens on there and we want to talk to them about teen cyber safety. That's the place where we should be going. So using some of that evidence, but I think also using examples from other government or similarly kind of risk-averse agencies can work really well. I think being able to put forward your plan for how you will manage things if the activity doesn't go as you had hoped. So the ability to say, that we will be monitoring, this is how we will deal with comments that are negative. If our hashtag gets hijacked or if things don't go well, what are your processes to deal with that? And that brings a level of comfort to senior leaders that what you're doing and that things will be managed effectively. So I think that that's really important. But at its core, I think it is about the strength of relationships that you've built with your internal clients across the board. And I know for people working in social media, it can sometimes be difficult. People can still see it as a nice to have, or something that we undertake that doesn't have a lot of strategy behind it. So reporting regularly about your work and building trust that when you do things, they go well, will help you, I think, get support to try things a bit differently over time. So sometimes you have to play the long game on that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important to have those foundations set up. And like you said at the beginning, that's some of that is comms 101. You know, we need to know where we're going and we need to know what success looks like. So I have a couple of questions still on my list, but I want to get to some of the questions from the participants. So Hannah has asked, without money, do you have recommendations for reaching more people via social media? Our agency is always asking to reach more people through social media and see that as a key success indicator. Our biggest indicator for success at the moment is our engagement rate for posts, and sometimes there is confusion internally as to why this is successful.
Yeah, that's a good question. And look, so many people are in that boat, and that came through in the survey responses that I received, was that, engagement is now, we've moved on from followers, and engagement is seen as the most critical measure. But again, without kind of understanding whether or not you're reaching the people that you actually intend to reach, it's hard to tell whether or not that's effective. So a couple of things on that. What I would recommend to start is that you don't always have to spend money on social media in order to reach new audiences and to get good engagement. So it certainly can help sometimes with changes that have been made to the way that the platforms are operating. But don't be too downhearted. You can still be quite effective while not paying for that reach. I think what's really important is having regular content on social media and not being afraid to trial a couple of things over several weeks or months and see what impact it has on your reach. So for example, at the War Memorial, we push out a fair bit of content, sort of between 200 and 300 posts a month across our social media accounts because we sort of say that every day at the War Memorial is an anniversary of some sort of historical event. So we have a lot of content to cover. But we were wondering whether or not the way that we were putting out content, if we put out so many posts a day, are we flooding our audience? Are they sick of us? Should we put out less? So we tried doing a bit less. Does that have a negative impact on our followers? And so we've actually found a good mid-range. Now, what works for us, though, might not work for you and your audience. And that's why it's really important to take that time to work out, perhaps for 2 or 3 weeks, we do 2 posts a day. And we do them at a similar time when we know our audience is mostly online, and we see how it goes. And then we might try for another 2 or 3 weeks to double that and push out a bit more. Does it grow our followers? Do we get more engagement because the algorithm's working in our favor or not? And just don't be afraid to trial things. I would also say that you cannot rely on social media alone to help grow your social media audience. And so finding other ways to reach out to people, whether it's through media interviews or podcast content or a webinar such as this, depends on your audience. Using those other channels to remind people about why getting regular information from you would be meaningful can really help to grow your audience and engagement. So, it might be email marketing or, other more traditional forms of communication can also help support your social media campaign. And then I think finally, it's also about doing some internal education about what social media metrics are valuable. And, it's certainly the case for me and my team at the moment where we do still report on some things that we've always reported on, but that don't really reflect the amount of work that we do or the way that people think about the content that we're putting out there. And so we're looking to change that too. So I think that stuff has to be a work in progress. But what I would recommend is choosing one topic, if you can, perhaps one campaign that helps solve a problem inside your business. So one might be, you get too many email queries to your mailbox from your website because each time, at a certain time each year, something happens, everyone's membership ends and they've all got questions. So you might pick something that is a problem for your organization but is manageable for you and your team to perhaps influence and measure. And then you come up with a campaign to support that. And you measure and track its success. And you don't just track the reach and engagement on your platforms, you also work with your colleagues in that area of your business to say, are email queries down? Or if you're still getting them, are they less complex because we've reached them on social media first with the right information? So I think if you can show some ways that you're reaching people, um, with powerful information rather than just, a like or a share, you can begin to influence how your organization sees the value of social media work. And that's without spending any money.
Absolutely. Great advice, Amanda, and keeps us on track because in the end it ensures that our communication remains purposeful and, like you said, solves problems in the business. And that's what builds our influence. Some great questions coming in. So Laura, thank you for such a great presentation. Did any of your research happen to touch on tools, platforms and software for managing social media? And if so, were there any standout findings?
That's a great question. So I did have some discussions about that with reps from the ATO and Human Services, because I spent sort of an hour or two with 6 people from there. And so both of those agencies are using a couple of platforms to deliver their work. And they've got different sort of operating models. And so the tools that they use vary, for those reasons. I didn't survey people about the tools that they're using. Because I did think that there were some other ways that I could get that information, and I sort of needed to limit my survey. But there are a couple of places, for example, the Digital Transformation Agency and a couple of other agencies have panels for, where different social media platforms can put forward their details to be sort of considered and used by government agencies. So there are a number there that are in use. Some that I know of, there's a whole kind of list, which I'd kind of be happy to give a summary to see it to go out with the slides, perhaps, of some that have been mentioned to me through discussions. I can't really recommend any because it really depends on the way that your team's working on things. So if you wanted to kind of find me on LinkedIn, you can search me. I'd sort of be happy to share and answer a few questions about that. But some of them cost a fair bit, and some have a free trial that you can use. So yeah, it really depends on your situation. But most agencies now are using something, but a lot still rely upon the analytics from Facebook and Twitter and Instagram natively, actually, in order to do their reporting.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. And I'll make sure to include a link to your LinkedIn profile in the wrap-up email that I'll be sending out later today, so that's fine. Okay, so Deb, Amanda, do you think that software that analyses social media impact will become cheaper and more sophisticated? How quickly do you think this will happen?
I do think it's getting better over time already, which is good. And I think that by using the tools, social media teams are helping tell those companies, what they need in order to get the most, kind of value for their money, and to help automate some aspects of their social media work. I don't know about whether the cost will come down. I think that that's tricky. I'd like to think so. There are a few more platforms that have come onto the market, which I do think helps. They need to be a bit more competitive. So, we've done out some of our own work, each year as we kind of renew the tools that we use. We do a bit of a scan for the market to see who's there. And often they'll kind of know what one another are charging and, kind of have some deals going. So I think that competitive environment creates some savings, but yeah, some of them can be quite expensive, particularly for smaller agencies. I think there's still a ways to go in some aspects, and sentiment analysis has always been a tricky one. I think when done well, it can be really powerful to say, you've reached a certain audience through social media, they've been really engaged, and now they think better about our brand than they did before we started out. But from my perspective, I don't really know of any automation that's happening at a level that I'd be comfortable distributing without providing some human analysis. So it is time-consuming work for your team if you want to go down the path of using that kind of social media tracking. But if you can do it for 1 or 2 campaigns a year, it can be really meaningful. But yeah, I do think they'll keep getting smarter. I think already they're integrating from a whole range of platforms. And I'll be interested to see where it goes with things like other CRM type platforms. So, organizations building a profile about people and the way that they engage with them, and integrating social media into that to see, whether or not people looking at your brand on social media end up making a purchase with your organization, and then become long-term supporters and donators, for example. I think that there's more work technology could do to integrate that. But my privacy alarm bells do ring, and I'm not a tinfoil hat person, but I'm pretty, I feel pretty strongly that, that just because we can integrate a lot of that information doesn't mean that we should, and we should be really careful about the decisions we make to do that.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. Now we've got a couple of minutes left. One final question from Serena. Hi, Amanda. Great to hear a bit more about your research. Your top recommendation was around establishing clear strategies. I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to get teams on board with developing these strategies and keeping people invested in them longer term, especially when priorities shift and resources are focused elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a good question, and perpetually, a challenge for comms teams, and particularly smaller ones. And as I said in my kind of early intro, 70% of the teams that I surveyed had 6 or less people, and they're looking after more than just social media activities. They're doing other comms or media work. And so we know that those teams are busy. I think getting your own team members to be really heavily involved in the development of strategies is really important. So even if they're not perhaps operating yet at that strategic level, being able to get everyone together to say, look, these are the 2 key challenges that we need to solve this year, and other things are going to pop up. We're not going to be able to do absolutely everything to the same level, but we're going to focus on these 1 or 2 things. Let's work together to develop a strategy. We'll refine it. And then I'm going to make, each of you responsible for a certain aspect of its delivery, or maybe one person's responsible for each strategy. But I think ownership and accountability is really important and helps people to buy into the work that you're delivering. But and it helps to keep them engaged. But I think also allowing them to have influence on the way that you approach some of your activities. So giving them the chance to be a bit more creative if possible, allowing them to make suggestions and recommendations that you take on board. They might not all work, but often in teams, junior staff members are used to just having to deliver stuff that they're told to do by others. Whereas, if you empower them to have some influence over whatever aspects they can, seeing their own ideas come to fruition is a really good way to engage them. And it also brings a different perspective to your work too. And then I do think having 1 or 2 people accountable for monitoring and reporting on that, and having some clear deadlines. So you expect to report every month, and chasing them up on that. So a bit of work for you too. I think having that in place means that it doesn't fall by the wayside when other things, perhaps shift your focus.
Thanks, Amanda. Well, it is the top of the hour, so we're going to have to leave it there. This was a really, really great discussion. Fantastic insights. Thank you so much for taking the lead on this research, Amanda. I think there might be a bit of appetite for some cross-agency collaboration here. So you may have opened a big can of worms, a good can of worms though. So thank you so much to you for your fantastic insights. Thank you also to all of you for attending. I'm going to be sending out the recording from today's webinar, as well as a copy of Amanda's slides and some of the other resources that Amanda mentioned sometime later today. I just want to quickly tell you about my final Lifting the Lid webinar for 2020, challenges and opportunities for internal communication professionals now and into the future, that I'm holding on Wednesday, the 25th of November at 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. And that's going to be with one of my favourite people, global internal communication thought leader, Mike Klein. He's based in Iceland. He's one of the smartest and most insightful internal communication professionals I've ever met, and I can't wait for our chat. We're going to be discussing the ongoing impact of the coronavirus pandemic on internal communication professionals, the implications of remote working on our work and workforces, the continuing struggle to demonstrate the strategic and financial value we add to organisations and society. So please stay tuned for more about that. Get in touch if you have any feedback about today. Thanks once again and enjoy the rest of your days. Bye for now.